Quantum consciousness, as espoused by Federico Faggin. What's missing? Let's take a look. Federico Faggin, physicist, inventor of the MOS silicon gate technology, which made possible memory chips, the microprocessor, author of this book, Irreducible, on quantum consciousness. Another assault on the hard problem, as currently misconceived, in my opinion. Interestingly, at the core of his thought, a mystical experience. To quote, I went back to bed, and while I was waiting for sleep to return, I suddenly felt a powerful rush of energy from my chest, like nothing I had ever experienced before. This alive energy was love, yet a love so intense and incredibly fulfilling that it surpassed any other notion I previously had about love. Even more surprising was the fact that the source of this love was me. I experienced it as a broad beam of shimmering white light. Then suddenly that light exploded. It filled the room and expanded to embrace the entire universe with the same white brilliance. I knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was the substance out of which everything that exists is made. Then with immense surprise, I recognized that I was that light. My relationship with the world had always been as a separate observer, perceiving the universe as outside myself and disconnected from me. What made this event astonishing was this impossible perspective, because I was both the experiencer and the experience. I was simultaneously observer and the world. This is wonderful. I can resonate via similar experience. But such an experience only gives you a guardrail. It keeps you from raw materialism. It may draw you to panpsychism. It did for Federico. He calls his theory QIP, quantum information-based panpsychism theory. It does not mean you grasp the hard problem. So let's see. When we look at the references of the book, there's 13 total. 9 with Faggin or his physicist sidekick, Dariano, 2 other physicists, one Shannon for information theory, one Chalmers for the hard problem. To me, this is not a good sign. It is a physicist idea that mainly their discipline is sufficient background for the problem. Though I'm quite sure that Faggin knows much other literature on the subject of consciousness, this is interesting that this framework is decided and chosen as the sufficient framework. We get to a solution of the hard problem at about page 223. This also is not a good sign to me. Other precedents, for example, Chopra and Kafados, You Are the Universe, 200 pages before the solution is offered, and it's not much of a solution. Or Howie, The Predictive Mind. He says initially he will offer a solution. When you get to page 200, he admits he has none. Just a couple examples. But Bergson, however, Matter and Memory, the solution is trotted out by page 30. Me, simply building on Bergson, taking a little bit more time to develop what his theory is page 45. Point being, if you have a solution, it really shouldn't take you that long to lay it out. So my main criterion when I take a look at these books is, by the time you get to page 136 or 200 or whatever, is there really an answer to this question? How does this account, this theory, for the origin of the image of the external world? It is the coffee cup, spoon, stirring, liquid swirling out there on the table, aka our experience, our sentience. That is how, when you take a look at the neuron with the voltage changes rippling down that neuron, and we see a bunch of such in the brain, how do we account for that image when there's nothing such like the coffee cup in the brain taking over those neurons? And the image has properties to account for. It exists at a scale of time, normally buzzing flies, versus what could be like heron-like flies, barely flapping their wings, or even electron cloud flies. The Minkowski diagram, the Minkowski space-time, has no particular scale. In fact, we like to visualize it for physics at the scale of quarks or electrons. But that's certainly not the scale that we perceive. And it has a time extent. We're seeing the spoon stirring, the liquid swirling, the wings flapping. We're seeing an extent of time. Therefore, you have to have a theory. If you think time is a set of discrete instant after instant, or quantum jump after quantum jump, a theory of short-term memory, which strings those instants together to form a continuity. But that's a logical difficulty one has to overcome. Lots of problems within that. Thirdly, it's reflective of the body's possible action in Gibson's terms of affordances. Is that being accounted for? The hard problem is often framed as why does it feel like something? But there are two components to this problem. One, the origin of the image of the external world, the coffee cup and stirring spoon. And two, the origin of affect, pain, feelings. But one, the origin of the image is the privilege problem. With the solution to it, the solution to two, that is affect, pain, feelings, naturally falls out. I discussed this in number 59, for example, somes and feelings. Chalmers, when he coined the problem, why does it feel like something, kind of set everyone on the wrong track. The origin of the image of the external world has been the problem in the science and philosophy of perception for 2,000 years. Anyone that was familiar with this subject matter of perception would not have framed the problem in the way Chalmers did. How does it feel like something? They would have said, well, how do you get the image of the external world? So just in that framing, Chalmers set a lot of people on the wrong path. So let's see. Quoting Faggin, the conversion from electrical signals to the scent experience of a rose is an example of the so-called hard problem of consciousness, as the philosopher David Chalmers defined it in 1995. This problem can be expressed as follows. What is the phenomenon responsible for our sensory, bodily, emotional, and mental experience, characterized by qualia? Of course, the qualia formulation is again part of the framework problem of framing the problem, especially if we're simply focusing sort of on the static notion of scent. Obviously part of the problem, but missing the whole. Again, the entire image is qualia. There's nothing in the coffee stirring. The motion of the spoon, the swirling, the qualities of motion, the actual forms themselves, there's nothing in the image that's not qualia. We could equally focus on the growth of the rose, that qualitative pattern of growth, the dynamic form unfolding as part of the problem. How do we perceive that form, that motion over time? To go on. For years, I unsuccessfully labored to understand how consciousness could also arise from electrical or biochemical signals. And I found that invariably electrical signals can only produce other electrical signals, but never sensations or feelings. I therefore came to the conclusion that consciousness has to be a fundamental property like electricity. In other words, I believe that consciousness must be an irreducible property of the elementary particles, quote unquote, of which everything is made, just as the electrical charge is a property that does not derive from any simpler properties. If this is the case, then everything in the universe must be conscious. This idea is millennia old and is called panpsychism. Accepting panpsychism implies that inner reality has a direct impact on outer reality, a possibility that deterministic physics denies. However, we know that the external world is brought within us through the processing of sensory information and becomes an inner experience. Well, that's interesting. Acceptance of indirect realism in a way. Is inner mean within the brain or somewhere inside some perceptual space? We'll see it's the latter. Moreover, if there is an influence from the outside to the inside, why shouldn't there be also an influence in the other direction? What is the point of having interiority? The problem is that a measurement of brain signals can reveal only some physical correlates of our conscious experience. but not the qualia that a person actually experiences. Consciousness allows us to perceive and understand the meaning of physical reality and of our emotions and thoughts. It does so through a sentient experience that transcends the blind translation of meaningless signals into other signals of the same kind that goes on in our computers. Again, the sentient experience, the whole coffee stirring. And he's saying consciousness transcends this, the sheer electrical signals, and makes this, the image of the external world. But how? How does consciousness turn chemical flows into the coffee cup and spoon? Again, we're already kind of invoking a magical framework here. Why does it choose a particular scale of time? We have consciousness choosing a particular scale of time. Why the heron-like fly versus the buzzing fly? And just what is the role of the brain, if any? Because everything is apparently unconsciousness at this point. Any explanatory power is starting to evaporate by this point. One more passage in this magic transcendence framework. The electrical chemical signals produced by our nervous system are manifestations distinct from our sensations and feelings that allow us to live those signals in the form of sensing experiences. Qualia and understanding are produced in our consciousness and suggest the existence of a reality vaster than unconscious physical reality. Consciousness defines the inner world of our experience, which is distinctly different from the physical world of signals. And so we come to the ever-useful mysterious space, like Yosha Bach's perceptual space in which the coffee is being stirred. To quote, "The semantic reality does not exist in the same space-time as physical reality, but in an experiential space and time, closer to our dreams, or to the space-time in which we experience the virtual reality created by a computer." This was Yosha Bach's framework. All those processes in the brain, perception processes, sort of end up somehow filling up a perceptual space where the coffee stirring lies. It's a very handy, useful space, a construct which explains nothing. Federico is very aware of panpsychism's combination problem. He quotes Chalmers. David Chalmers puts the problem this way: how can micro-phenomenal properties combine to form macro-phenomenal properties? In other words, how can the consciousness of each little atom combined to form the consciousness we have, the experience we have of the coffee cup and stirring spoon? Difficult problem. He argues that the solution lies in quantum mechanics. To quote, "The transformation of the properties of a single sodium atom and the properties of a single chlorine atom into the completely new properties of one molecule of sodium chloride is a quantum phenomenon that classic physics cannot explain." But we'll be frustrated in finding more explication on how this framework of higher quantum properties could ever result in the experience of stirring coffee. It's just simply not explicated very well at all how we're going to put together those various molecules in some sort of quantum framework and still get a coffee stirring experience. It's just not there within the book. It's sad to say, again, this is unawareness that Bergson already stated a panpsychic model with a concrete mechanism accounting for the image of that coffee. If we take Federico's quantum field and allow that it's also an equally a holographic field, as Bergson argued, as Bohm argued, then we have a start. The field for Bergson is also indivisibly transforming, but in the holographic property, given each point in the field, the state of each point is the reflection of the states of all other points in the field. Each point, the state of each point reflecting the whole. Then there's an elementary awareness, so to speak, defined throughout. when taken at the null scale of time, that is the most infinitely small scale of time one can imagine, in which there's yet change. There's always change. Nothing's ever static. So we have an elementary awareness defined throughout the field, giving us indivisibly transforming. There's an elementary property of memory. Also in the indivisible transformation, that is, we don't have a series of states or instants, instant after instant, discrete instant, which we somehow have to glue together to form a continuous perception state of the stirring spoon. This is the framework that allows us to evade the problem of short-term memory and explaining the time-extended experience we have of coffee stirring and swirling surfaces, etc. So the holographic field has an elementary awareness and an elementary property of memory at the null scale. But the holographic field has another aspect, because we can take a reconstructive wave, as in the picture on the upper right, drive it or beam it through the hologram, and the wave rising to the eye, the object wave is specific to an original source, say a cup, where of course the information on the plate is undecipherable until you drive an object wave or a reconstructive wave through the plate. Similarly, Bergson argued that the brain acts as the modulated reconstructive wave, passing through, beaming through, shall we say, the holographic field, the hologram. And it's specific to then a source within the field, now appearing as an image, the coffee cup and the stirring spoon. And it's a direct specification. The cup is specified right where it is, within the field, not within the brain, not within some perceptual space. The chemical dynamics underlying this wave, the vibrating neural mass, also specify or underlie the scale of time being specified. I've argued LSD acting on the 5H2R receptor via electronic induction raises the oscillation of the entire neural mass. So if we have a buzzing fly at our normal scale, raising the oscillation frequency will slow down the whole perception. The fly will be barely flapping his wings. The spoon will be stirring more slowly. The swirls more slowly. And, of course, there's a structure to that event. For Gibson and ecological psychology, J.J. Gibson, there's a lot of invariance laws defining those events, velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, etc. This dynamic invariance structure is the driver of the modulation patterns, the changing modulation patterns passing through that holographic field and specifying various events. So this is a concrete mechanism. It avoids any problem with the combination problem via the reconstructive wave. And it very much answers and would very much make Federico quite happy. There's an implication here in Bergson that subject and object are related in terms of time, not space. That is, there's no spatial distinction in this field between the cup and the guy there. There is a temporal distinction. That is, the brain waves, the whole body brain wave is specific to that cup at a different scale of time, the buzzing fly or the heron-like fly. But there's no spatial distinction. And that specification is in effect equally to a time-scaled form of awareness, the elementary awareness, indivisibly transforming, defined across the field. Hence, when you have a bit of mystical experience, one can see this, that you are one with the field. And this, I think, would make Federico quite happy. But unfortunately, this is all within Bergson, who yet to this day is very buried. Postscript. There was a comment on the integrated information theory / magic video in April 2025, a piece of it being, IIT is metaphysical agnostic, and that's why a lot of materialists find it magical or woo-woo. he thinks Bergson and I are materialist, which is wrong. Understand the paradigm had shifted, whether you personally can understand it or not. And it's suggesting to check out Levine, Friston, Kastrup for my mind's rectification. Might as well add in Hoffman, Faggin, Bach, and others. What's interesting about the respect given to these current theories is this. There's very little addressing of any of these questions. Is consciousness necessary for cognition? If yes, why? What is the relation of consciousness to cognition? If you don't need it, why? What is AGI? What is our general intelligence? What is required? Why might AIs never be able to achieve this? How is consciousness related? Federico takes his shots at AI. He does not think machines have the quantum consciousness that AI is necessary, but there's little exploration of these kinds of questions beyond that. In other words, what do these theories actually have to say about this problem? What about AI's neural scaling laws? Is there any reality to them? Is experience stored in the brain? If yes, how? If not, why? If not, how does memory work? There should be, remember, Bergson's model implies that perception is, therefore experience is not stored in the brain. Therefore, there's a whole different model of consciousness, cognition and memory retrieval implied. That could well be a part of your consciousness theory. Yes or no? What's the mechanism of analogical reminding? Remember, Hofstadter couldn't find one, definitely needed one. Any theory of memory retrieval whatsoever implied in this theory? Or is it all just stored in the brain? Does the theory even have the resources to address this or any of these questions? Related, what's the theory of short-term memory? How do you account for perceiving stirring spoons? This is Bergson's forgotten question. Is experience stored in the brain? If you're watching this stirring spoon, you're having to store in some memory storage area in the brain instant after instant after instant, then reconstruct the motion. What's your model of that? Because that's obviously the essence of the experience of stirring coffee. Does the theory even see a problem? Well, most do not. How about explicit memory? It's considered a function of consciousness. Is this problem addressed at all? Why is it related to consciousness? How does the theory incorporate affordances? Gibson's invariance laws. Well, most do not even bother to see these as anything to deal with. How do psychedelic drugs work, like LSD? Why might LSD affect the perceived scale of time? Again, you may not address all of these. There's other theories, things I don't address in my little efforts, but surely some of these should be addressed. But I think, in other words, these theorists and their appreciative audiences all seem to think this, that a theory of consciousness has basically zero implications for cognition, for AI, memory, perception. Given this idea, yep, they're great theories. Well, maybe not. So next, we'll see, again, I urge taking a look at this book, Challenge to AI. Many of these thoughts, deeper explication of Bergson's model reside therein. You might be interested. So next time we'll see. Till then, signing off.